So today we're going to talk about shelf stability. What is shelf stability? Well, in essence, it's how long your products will stay shelf stable or will not go bad when you're selling it on the grocery store. So you can have a product that has a shelf stability of 6 months or 1 year or 2 years. You have to keep this in mind when you are designing your product. How long do you want your product to last? If your product is supposed to last 6 months, well, there's things you have to do in order to make that product last 6 months. Now, when most people go about making a product or designing a product, they make it at home and don't give any foresight to shelf stability. And what I mean by this is you can make a product, you put it in your fridge, and maybe within 2 weeks or 3 weeks it goes bad, or about a month and a half it goes bad, and you don't really care because you could just make a new batch. And it may even go bad at different times. One time you make it, it's about a month till it starts to get moldy. The next time it might be 2 months before it starts to get moldy. Again, when you're making this at home, it really doesn't matter. However, when you're selling it in the mass grocery stores, it's going to be a big deal. So you need to keep this in mind when you're designing a product. It has to be shelf stable for the mass market and for the commercial market. I actually ran into this when I was making my product, the Supernova hot sauce. I always made hot sauce for myself, for my friends, family. And when I made my hot sauce, I'd put it in the fridge and don't even remember exactly how long it would stay good for. So I'd put it in the fridge maybe a month, month and a half, and I'd start to see a little bit of mold grow on it. No big deal. I'd just throw the batch away if it took too long to eat and it got moldy. And I'd just make a new batch. No big deal. Maybe the next time I made it, it would last 2 months. Maybe it lasts a month. Again, not a big problem because you're just making it at home. As soon as it goes bad, you just throw it away and make a new one. However, if you're going to be selling this in stores, this needs to be a calculated process. What I mean by this is you have to guarantee that your product will stay shelf stable for a particular amount of time. So with my hot sauce, what I had to do was I had to research how hot sauces themselves are made into a shelf stable product. And I found out that hot sauces are considered acidified products. What this means is that their shelf stability is determined by the level of acidity, particularly how low the acidity is. Acidified products need to have an acidity that's at or below 4.6 pH, meaning that the acidity level has to be at a 4.6 or lower. Now, it's customary in the food industry to go a little lower to about 4.2, and this gives a little wiggle room in case the acidity goes up while it's on the shelves and while it's being stored, because this can happen sometimes. However, I had to go and buy a pH testing kit, and I had to adjust my recipe by adding a little bit more vinegar, by adding a little more lemon juice, so to speak, whatever I needed to do to lower the pH. The acidity of my hot sauce eventually ended up at around 3.6. And what this did for my recipe is made it shelf stable for up to 2 years. After I cooked my hot sauce, when the pH was 3.6, the hot sauce stayed shelf stable for 2 years. In fact, it will never even go bad with that low of a pH. What will happen is after 2 years, it just probably won't taste as good as it used to, but it'll never get bad enough where bacteria or mold will grow and make you sick. So you need to keep this in mind when designing your own product. Now we're going to talk about a few different ways that products are made into shelf-stable products, or what different methods can be used to make your product more shelf-stable. The method that you use to make your product more shelf-stable will be determined by the type of product. Obviously, not all products are going to be made shelf-stable in the same way. So for example, milk is made shelf-stable by refrigeration and pasteurization. We can't just acidify milk. I mean, we can't add acid to it, lemon juice or vinegar into milk to make it more shelf stable. It'll ruin the milk right away. So depending on what type of product you have will determine what type of method you're going to be using to make the product more shelf stable. So what are some of these shelf stable methods or preservative methods? So one of them is called low temperature preservation. Low temperature preservation is used when the product is refrigerated or frozen. So if you open up your fridge, anything really that's refrigerated is using the low temperature or refrigeration process to make the product more shelf stable. This can include things like milk, cheeses, eggs, breads, even fruits and things like this if you put them in your fridge. So If you see a product that says refrigerate after opening, they're using the cold temperatures of the refrigerator to make it more shelf stable. As in, if you see a product that says it has a best before for 2 months and it says keep refrigerated, it's saying that it will be good for 2 months if this product is refrigerated. Another low temperature method of preservation is freezing. Freezing is pretty straightforward. If you open up your freezer, everything that's in there is going to have a freezing preservation method. So frozen peas, frozen berries, anything that you put in the freezer, frozen meats, things like this, frozen fish, they may have a shelf life of 1 to 2 years. And the way they achieve this is by freezing the product and keeping it at such low temperatures that the growth of bacteria and fungus is almost halted. So freezing is one of the best ways of preservation if the food product is suited for it. You can't freeze eggs, right? So not all products are suited for freezing. If you freeze eggs, once they're thawed out, they won't be the same product anymore, right? So you got to keep this in mind. Not all products can be preserved in the same way. Another way of preserving food products is called high temperature preservation. There's a few methods of high temperature preservation. One of them we skimmed upon for milk is called pasteurization. Now, pasteurization is a method where you take the particular food item or food product, raise it to a certain temperature, and hold that temperature for a certain amount of time in order to kill majority of the bacteria or halt the growth. So milk, this is done with milk as well. They either do it in vats or in high-speed pasteurization through tubes. So they may raise the milk's temperature to 70 degrees Celsius and hold it there for 15 minutes, killing majority of the microbes and fungus and bacteria, so that then they can put it into bags or boxes in which you would have to refrigerate it. But both these processes together will increase the shelf life of the milk. So pasteurization is one method. Things like juices are pasteurized, milk is pasteurized, creams are pasteurized, things like this. Pasteurization is used quite a bit in the food industry in order to preserve food products. Another high temperature method of preservation is called sterilization. Sterilization is when you take the temperature of the product very high, above 100 degrees, usually about 115 to 118 degrees Celsius, and this essentially cooks the product, in fact, beyond the boiling point of water, and essentially sterilizes everything inside. So it'll sterilize the bacteria and the microbes and everything, killing everything that's inside. So what are some things that are sterilized? For example, salsas. If you see salsas, they're sold on the shelves and it says refrigerate after opening, but before you open them, you can keep their salsa on the shelf for 1 year, 2 years maybe, and it'll stay perfectly fine because that jar of salsa has been shut and closed, and then after it has been closed, the temperature has been raised to about 120 degrees, killing everything inside. So jams are done this way, salsas are done this way. Anything that's canned tomatoes, maybe canned tuna, things like this are all preserved with a sterilization method, which means, again, raising the temperature to such a high temperature that kills everything inside the food. Now, not all products, again, can be sterilized because if you raise the temperature of the food product that high in some foods, then the flavor and the texture and everything is ruined. So, for example, you cannot raise the temperature of eggs to 120 degrees because you'll cook the eggs. Same with milk. If you boil the milk or get it above 120 degrees, it will no longer taste like milk. It'll taste like cooked milk. And that's not the product we're looking for when we go to buy milk. So again, not all products can be made shelf stable in the same way. You have to look at which product you're making and how that product is made into a shelf stable product. Another way of preserving products is called dry preservation. Dry preservation is pretty straightforward, and dry preservation is done by reducing the moisture content in the food. So anytime you see dried nuts, dried fruits, anything that's dehydrated, beef jerky, things like this. So when you remove the moisture out of the food product, the bacteria does not have enough water in there to grow. So anything that's dried, as in all the moisture has been taken out to a certain percentage, and you have to measure this as well. Once that happens, then no bacteria or mold or anything can grow because all these pathogens and all these microbes require water to grow. So drying the food, dehydrating the food will make it shelf stable as well. Another way we can make the products more shelf stable is by increasing the sugar content. So if you increase the sugar content of a food to a very high level, the product again will not go bad because Sugar, what it does is it absorbs the moisture inside the product and doesn't allow any other microbes or bacteria or anything to grow, because the sugar content is way too high in that particular product for any to create a environment where any bacteria or pathogens can grow. So something that would use a high sugar content to preserve would be a thing like a jam, maybe a marmalade, um, any sort of sugared fruits. You ever see the fruits that have a bunch of sugar on them, and they're preserved in sugar? Things like this, having a high sugar content, is another method manufacturers use to increase the shelf life of a food. Another one we can talk about is called salt preservation. Now, salt preservation has been used by humans for thousands of years. If you think of anything like salted fish or salted meats, people have been using this for thousands of years before even refrigerators were invented, in order to preserve food products for days, if not weeks or months. Very few things are preserved in salt now, but some things still are. If you have ever seen dried fish or salted meats, things like this are preserved using salt. So it is rare, but if your product is one that calls for salt preservation, then you must look into this in order to extend the shelf life of your product. Now, the key to remember with all these different preservation methods is which one applies to your food product. So if you're making a salad dressing, chances are that that food product is going to be preserved through an acidification process, which means lowering the pH or increasing the acidity. If you're making a tomato sauce, which is in a jar, chances are that's going to be a high temperature sterilization method. So if you're designing a product, you must research yourself as to how this food product is made into a shelf stable product. Now, I can't go over the in-depth of every product and in detail how to preserve and all the different variables, because this video would be 2 hours. However, it is your job to look up what type of product you're making, how do manufacturers preserve this product, and buy the necessary equipment or figure out the necessary processes in order for you to make your product more shelf stable. Now, the next thing we're going to be talking about is availability of ingredients. How are you going to make your product into a product which can be sold on the mass scale or on the grocery store shelves? And part of the way you're going to do that, or the process you're going to use to do that, is figuring out what ingredients you're going to use and figuring out how available the ingredients are that are in your recipe. Check out this video next.